Hi folks, today we're going to be talking about Tutankhamun, the boy king of ancient Egypt, and all of the mysteries and misunderstandings surrounding him, here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Hi folks, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair, one intellectual's musings from the comfort of a big purple wingback. I'm your host, Professor Timothy R. Crowe. You know, if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that a couple of weeks ago, I covered the pharaoh Akhenaten and his Ottanism, and a lot of the myths and misconceptions about both Akhenaten, his reign, as well as his religion. And in there, I spoke of his very famous son and one of his successors, Pharaoh Tutankhamun, and I promised that I'd do a video. So here we are about Tutankhamun. And of course, Tutankhamun is kind of ironically the most famous pharaoh of them all here in modern times. Everyone's heard of King Tut, as he's called for short. However, why is he the most famous of all the pharaohs? Well, it's because of the discovery of his almost completely intact tomb in 1922, which was found by Howard Carter and his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon. And that's really one of the reasons that he is so famous. However, because of this, even though we found his tomb, and we found all of these fantastic funeral goods within that tomb, there's still a lot of myths and misunderstandings and things that are not quite clear about Tutankhamun, or at least weren't during the time it was discovered and even up until fairly recent times. So I thought that it was time to cover Tutankhamun. So therefore, let me take you back in time, first to November 4th, 1922. Howard Carter was working on a dig, in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes. Now, a small cache known as a funerary cache or an embalming cache had been found in that area sometime before. Now, a funerary cache or embalming cache is when they've embalmed a pharaoh and mummified a pharaoh, and they performed all the rituals for that pharaoh. Sometimes they have scraps and things left over. The salt, the natron, which is a combination of salt and baking soda that they use to dry him out, extra bandages, things like that. Well, usually they bundle all these things together because they had been involved in the magical ritual and had touched the body of the pharaoh, and they would give them a ritual burial, usually with a funerary meal. And they would bury these goods. And of course, where would they bury them? Usually near the pharaoh's tomb. Well, one of these funerary or embalming caches had been found, and it bore the names of the pharaoh Nebmatre Tutankhamun, and that was known as a pharaoh that came after Akhenaten, who had ruled around 1335 to 1323 BCE, so 3,300 years before. And very little was known about this pharaoh, other than it appeared that he hadn't ruled very long, no more than 10 years. Now, ironically, when this was first found, the archaeologists that found it thought that this is the last remnants of this small, unimportant pharaoh. However, Howard Carter knew better. He knew that this was not the last bit of the actual funeral, the actual tomb of Tutankhamun, but most likely that it was this embalming cache or funerary cache, and he knew that Tutankhamun's tomb had to be nearby. In fact, looking at the tombs above where the cache was found and the two tombs to the side, he knew it had to be in this triangle somewhere. So he laid out a grid and he started digging. Well, on November 4th, 1922, while they were doing the dig, and actually Lord Carnarvon was about to cancel everything because he'd been financing Carter since 1907, and they really hadn't found much. And Carter just kept coaxing him to go on. On this particular day, a water boy happened to trip over a jutting stone, and Carter was a very good Egyptologist and a very good archaeologist, and he knew stone and he knew how to cut stone. So when he saw this stone, he realized it wasn't just an ordinary stone on the ground, but it was part of a cut step. So he immediately set to work there. First steps were found. By November 24th, they had cleared all of the steps, and they had found the door to the tomb, and the tomb was actually still sealed. And on the seal, it bore the name Malaria Tutankhamun, and he had found Tutankhamun's tomb, and it was still sealed. However, he wasn't getting too excited, because he had noticed that there had been a robber's hole that had been filled in at the top, and he's like, it's most likely been robbed in antiquity. It's probably empty, or at least and with very little inside. So he didn't get his hopes too high, just like every other tomb in the Valley of the Kings that had been robbed. Either way, Lord Carnarvon came down, and on November 26th, Carter cleared a small hole from the stone in the door, and he peeked inside, and he brought a light up to see. And Carnarvon, his wife, and another guest was there, and and Carnarvon asked him, "Do you see anything?" And Carter said, "Yes, wonderful things." And truly, he was seeing some wonderful things, because he was looking into the first chamber of the tomb, and before him was the glitter of gold of a nearly intact tomb. We're talking royal beds, thrones, chairs, as well as chariots. He was seeing supplies for the pharaoh, and all of it was a glitter of gold. And thus the tomb of Tutankhamun had been discovered almost completely intact, and making it the only tomb in the Valley of the Kings to remain intact since ancient times. And Howard Carter was the first man to look inside that tomb in 3,300 years. Well, they opened the tomb, and they found just what a true treasure this was. In fact, it was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. Inside, they found the golden beds of Tutankhamun. They found Tutankhamun's throne. They found his jewelry. They found his clothing. They found his game boards, lamps. They found stored food. Apparently, he was very fond of duck, and very fond of white wine. They found just everything that a pharaoh would need into the next life. And as they opened on the back wall, they found two statues standing guarding what was obviously the hole in the wall that had been filled in that would go into the actual burial chamber itself. And in this small burial chamber, they found a golden mausoleum, of gilded wood, completely covered in gold. Within that, they found the stone sarcophagus. Within the stone sarcophagus, they found three coffins, one which was made of silver and one which was made of solid gold. And then they found, once they removed all of that, they found the mummy of the pharaoh Tutankhamun himself, wearing his gorgeous golden death mask, which is one of the greatest pieces, the most famous pieces of ancient art in the world, which is still on display in the Cairo Museum with all the rest. And then they got down and they was investigating the mummy. What was discovered was a very young pharaoh. In fact, it appeared that Tutankhamun was no more than 19 at the time of his death. All the statuary inside showed him as a boy pharaoh growing into a man, as he grew into a man. But this brought up as many questions as it did answers. Well, how did this young pharaoh die? And why is he in such a very small tomb, whereas the rest of the pharaohs were buried in these big, enormous tombs? Tutankhamun was buried in a tomb, basically almost a hole in the ground compared to these pharaohs. Why was he buried in such a way? Also, a lot of the furniture and the burial equipment that was put in there bore the names of other pharaohs. So what was going on here? And also, so who was he? Who was his parents? And what was his story? Why was he buried in this way? And how did he die? Well, we're going to go into all that and what we've found out since then. Now, as I said, there's been a lot of things about Tutankhamun that we didn't know, and a lot of mysteries. And the more we seem to find when looking at his mummy and looking at his funerary goods, as spectacular they are, seem to raise as many questions as they did answers. Who was Tutankhamun the son of? Was he the son of Akhenaten? Was he the son of Amenhotep III, perhaps? Or was he the son maybe of the short-lived pharaoh Semenkhare? Exactly who was his mother? No, there was very little archaeological evidence from the hieroglyphic reliefs talking about Tutankhamun or his background. He was never pictured as a prince on any wall. He was, or none that we could directly identify, and he was never actually named anywhere. We did know he had been a pharaoh. He had left some reliefs on some walls, some statuary, but very little, and a lot of it had been taken over by pharaohs that came after him. So we really didn't know a lot about this pharaoh before his tomb was found, and now with this fantastic find, the questions become: where does he fit? Where, who was he? Who was his parent? Exactly where his parents? Where does he fit in ancient Egyptian history? Well, there's been a lot of research done. It's kind of ironic that this is the most well-known pharaoh in the world because of this discovery, and historically we knew very, very little about him. Well, we've learned quite a bit since Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun. And, so first, what we do know, Tutankhamun was likely born around 1341 BCE, meaning before the Common Era. So about, over 3,300 years ago. And where he was born is not really recorded, and exactly who his parents were was not really recorded that was found back then. However, it was assumed that he was a son of the famous pharaoh Akhenaten, and born during the Amarna period. Even though they hadn't found any reliefs containing him. However, we did know that he was, as it said in the hieroglyphs, in his tomb and on some of his funerary cache, that he was the pharaoh king, son of the king's body, meaning he was the natural son of a pharaoh. And really, just by using basic logic, it almost had to be Akhenaten, who had ruled for 17 years. He was he was about 9 years old from what we can figure out at the time that that he took the throne, and Akhenaten had ruled for 17 years, and this enigmatic other pharaoh we still don't know a lot about, named Semenkhare, who may have been one of the younger brother of Akhenaten, or possibly an older son, had ruled for 2 years. So it had been 19 years at least since Amenhotep III died. So the speculation that Tutankhamun was Amenhotep III's younger son was pretty much counted out. He'd been long dead before Tutankhamun came along, and if he was a son of the king's body, that left either Akhenaten or Semenkhare. However, Dr. Zahi Hawass was looking at some of the stones at Akhenaten, the city built by Akhenaten, and on these stones they had been used to build the monuments at Akhenaten. Now, normally the pharaohs built tombs out of huge stone, but this was a quick put together city by Akhenaten, and they used these smaller stones, almost like giant bricks, that they used to build their monuments. Many of them had been dismantled, but and it is among some of these dismantled stones that Zahi Hawass found some stones that did speak of Tutankhamun, and it named him as the son of the king, and the king at that time was Akhenaten. So that pretty much solved that. Tutankhamun was the younger son of Akhenaten, and his name had originally been Tutankhaten, meaning the living image of the Aten. And obviously he had been born there at Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten's new capital city that didn't last long. And from a stele we know that it was Tutankhamun who, after his father's death, and when he came to the throne finally at the age of 9, moved the capital of Egypt from Akhenaten back to the traditional capital in Thebes, and he changed which was the nome of the god Amun and the great cult of Amun, and he changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, from living image of the Aten to the living image of Amun, rejecting his father's religious revolution and returning Egypt to the gods, and that's what he was known for, at least in this stele. Of course, he was 9 years old, and a 9-year-old pharaoh isn't making a lot of decisions. The ones making decisions are his courtiers, are his administrators, and the two most likely involved in that were his vizier, and Horemheb, who was the commander of the Egyptian army, the head general of the Egyptian army. They were the man, them particularly, as well as a few others, were the man that really called the shots for this young pharaoh. They were kind of the regents, especially Now, had been is believed to have been the father of Nefertiti. Thus was the father-in-law to the pharaoh, and also we believe that he was the son of Yuya and Tuya, who was Yuya was a charioteer general in the army of Amenhotep III, and his sister was Queen T, who was the wife of Amenhotep III and was the mother of Akhenaten. So these were the tomb, and he was I was a very powerful man, an older man. That would have, and we know that Tutankhamun, from some of the reliefs in the tomb, as well as on his throne that was put into the tomb, as well as one of the chairs and a few other artifacts, we know that he was married to his sister Akhenaten, who was the youngest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, thus making her grandfather and Tutankhamen's uncle, at least great uncle, because of his grandmother. However, the one thing that we didn't know was exactly who was Tutankhamen's mother. A long time it was never believed to have been Nefertiti, because he was never shown with in the reliefs with Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It was always with them, who was always showing their children with them, but all their children were named, and it was all their daughters, and they had 6. So it was then believed that Tutankhamun must have been a young son of one of his lesser wives, and one of them's name was Kia. And it was often believed that Kia was kind of the second favorite wife to Akhenaten, had been the mother. However, it turned out, after all that time, not to be true. Actually, we did find in like 2010, we actually discovered the identity of his mother, sort of. There had been found in one of the tombs of an earlier pharaoh, Amenhotep II, in a side chamber, three mummies. And these three mummies had been mostly denuded. They weren't in their coffins. They didn't have anything to identify them. And it was automatically recognized as this was, a reburial to hide them. And in around the 21st or 22nd dynasty, it was discovered that many of the tombs of the pharaohs in the past had been robbed, and the mummies denuded and often damaged to get the jewels off of them. And Penejeb, Penejeb II, pharaoh, when he found this out, he went on a great expedition, a great project to inspect all the tombs that had been robbed and take what was found, the pharaohs and the pharaohs' mummies, and a lot of other royal mummies, and take them and put them into mummy caches to hide them and protect them. In fact, a great cache was found in the 1900s that held most of the pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasty. That's why the mummies of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, Seti the First, Merenptah, Tutmosis Tutmosis the First, Tutmosis the Second. So many of these pharaohs' mummies were found. They were found in these caches, and that was the huge one. However, there are a few other small ones, and these three mummies that were in a side chamber to the tomb of Amenhotep III, Amenhotep II, look to have been some of these stored, these rescued and restored mummies. And the three mummies laying in there was one of a child, which is never really been identified. We think we know who it may have been, but even more than that, there was two female mummies. One was an elderly lady with still long hair, still very striking woman, and there was also a younger woman with a shaved head, who looks like her mummy and her mouth had been severely damaged, missing one arm, that was laying on the other side. And it wasn't really clear who these pharaohs were, who these mummies were. However, in Tutankhamun's tomb helped identify one of them. In his tomb, there was found a small little mummy case, and inside, and it bore the name of Queen T, his grandmother. And inside, when they opened up this little miniature coffin, they found a lock of hair. This was a memento from his beloved grandmother, a lock of her hair. So the hair was actually compared to the hair of the elder woman in the tomb, and back then they didn't have DNA, but it looked to be a match, and it was then believed that this was the body of the famous Queen T, the powerful and charismatic queen and mother of Akhenaten. But we still didn't know who the younger lady, which the mummy came to be known, who she was. Well, in 2010, they finally took Tutankhamun out of his tomb. He remained in his tomb that whole time. It was decided, being as he had been the only pharaoh found intact, that even though it took everything else out, he would remain in his tomb in his golden coffin. But he hadn't left that tomb since his discovery. Except for, and finally it was decided to do an inspection of his mummy and to do a CT scan and take some DNA samples. Well, those DNA samples, one, they were linked to a couple of mummies that helped solve some issues. Number one, it was found they also took DNA from the little sample of hair and from the hair of the elder woman, and it did prove that this was the mummy of Queen T, the mother of Akhenaten. And we also had the mummy of Amenhotep III. Well, with those two two pieces of DNA, they were able to identify another unknown mummy, the famous KV-55 mummy. Now, the KV-55 mummy, there had been a small chamber, pretty much wrecked. They found a strange coffin, and then this coffin had part of the face hacked away. The the cartouches had been purposely carved out. And when they opened it up, they found a very water-damaged mummy that actually just disintegrated once they opened it down to the bone. But looking at the skull, it was believed that this may have been Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. And even though he was a heretic, he was still a pharaoh. He'd been buried, but they carved his name away. And the way that they put him, they had buried him in this small chamber, shows a form of humiliation and actually even some punishment towards him. So it was believed that this was Akhenaten. Well, when they discovered Queen T, that this was definitely Queen T, and they could compare the two sets of DNA from Amenhotep III and Queen T, they proved that this was a child, this male skeleton, this male mummy that had been found, was a son of both Amenhotep III and Queen T. Thus, it is likely to be Akhenaten. And in fact, Zahia Was and a couple of other Egyptologists, underneath this mummy, they did find some small pieces of gold foil that had part of a cartouche name, and that one name on there was Robbery, which is part of the name of Akhenaten, Wahare. So obviously, with that, it pretty much proves that this is not Semenkari, but it is Akhenaten. But the most incredible discovery was that when they did the DNA from Tutankhamun, not only did they find that the DNA does match with Akhenaten's, but also it was discovered that the younger lady was his mother. This younger lady mummy that had been laying beside the Queen T was definitely the mother of Tutankhamun. But not only that, the DNA comparison showed that she was also the daughter of Akhenaten. The daughter of Queen T and Amenhotep III. Thus, Akhenaten had married one of his sisters, and they had produced a royal son, Tutankhaten, who would become Tutankhamun. So thus, but here's the thing: we don't know. We have her mummy. We know she's his mother. We know she is a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen T, which is why she was left there beside of him. She was laid beside of her mother. Both had been mother. Not only was they mother and daughter, but both had been mothers of pharaohs. So we know that she's one of their daughters. We know she's Tutankhamun's mother, but we don't know which daughter that it is. A little bit of deduction helps. We know that Amenhotep III had married several of his daughters. He had 8, and it basically that we know of. And it came down to really the last 2 daughters. That he had married 6 of his daughters. It come down to the last 2. A daughter named Nebta, or possibly a daughter named Akhenaten. However, it has to be one of the 2 for Akhenaten to have married. However, there is a possibility, a strong possibility, that Nebta and Akhenaten are the same person. Akhenaten was never mentioned until Akhenaten's Aten revolution. All of a sudden, this Akhenaten pops up, and we don't hear anything about Nebta. She seems to disappear. And it's very likely, I think, that Nebta had married her brother, which the royals married like that all the time. Gross to us, but they commonly married brothers and sisters because they were royal. They were royal blood and got divine blood, and you had to keep that divine blood, as pure as you could, at least in theory. So it looks like perhaps Nebta, once she married her brother, she joined with his religion and changed her name from Nebta to Akhenaten. So therefore, if that's true, if Akhenaten and Nebta are the same person, that narrows down that Nebta or Akhenaten was the mother of Tutankhamun. So therefore, this is the most likely maternal link for Tutankhamun. Well, now that we have established who King Tut was, who his parents were, and how he fits into the 18th dynasty, now we can talk about some of what happened during his reign. And unfortunately, doesn't look like a lot. I mean, you got to remember that he was 9 years old when he came to the throne, and a 9-year-old pharaoh isn't really ruling much. The actual day running of the country would have been of the kingdom would have been done by his vizier and by his commanding general of the army, Horemheb. And in fact, it looks like there was a very special relationship between Horemheb and Tutankhamun, because almost like a father figure. Because Horemheb, of course, as the head of the army, would have been in charge of the pharaoh's security. Number one. And number two, he would have been in charge of his military training, his martial arts training, and how to use sword, how to ride chariots, how to use spears, and how to fight, which is what a pharaoh needed to know. So there seems to have been a special relationship there. In fact, he even made Horemheb the hereditary prince, the Urpat, which means that in case the pharaoh dies without a son, he would be like an adopted son who could become pharaoh. And actually, Horemheb did become pharaoh later on. But I'm not going to go into that. I will do a video on that because Horemheb is my favorite pharaoh. So, everything was being run mostly by the administration by these men, especially who was the older statesman, really kind of the prime minister, the man with all the political crowd. He had served Akhenaten during his time period as a vizier, and he'd likely been both Akhenaten's uncle as well as his father-in-law, if Nefertiti is indeed the daughter of which is now believed. So therefore, that would have also made Tutankhamun, Nefertiti would have been both his stepmother and his cousin, as she was was the brother of Queen T, making his great uncle. As Tutankhamun married his sister from Nefertiti and Akhenaten, that would also made his wife's grandfather, and would have made him his as well as the pharaoh's great uncle. So he had a family ties that also, part of the royal family, at least married in part of the royal family, and helped him be in charge. And that become important later on, because about the time Tutankhamun was getting grown and could have really made a name for himself, he suddenly died at the age of about 19. And was a big mystery for a long time what exactly killed this young pharaoh. Well, number one, let's remember that in ancient times, most people didn't live past the age of 40, and so for someone to die, before 20 was not that odd. In fact, there seemed to be some hallmarks. A lot of children died before the age of 5. If you made it to 5, you'd probably make it if you made it to 5, you'd probably make it to 20. If you didn't die around 20, you would probably make it to 40. 40, most people died. If you got past that, then you might make it to 50 and 60. But Tutankhamun kind of died before 20. So even with the death rate and life expectancy back then, it was tragic, but it really wasn't that odd. But yet, in modern times, one of the big questions is what exactly killed Tutankhamun. So examinations of his mummy didn't seem to show any type of citable injury. But for one thing, Tutankhamun's mummy was a complete mess, which was a real disappointment. Number one, when Howard Carter opened that coffin, he found that he was basically glued inside of that coffin from all of the ointments they had poured. As he said, it looked like they had poured gallons of ointments and perfumes over top of the pharaoh, and that had settled in the bottom and hardened like glue, almost like amber, and just sealed him in that coffin. And unfortunately, it was and as shocking as it would seem, Um, Howard Carter took the shot. Today it would make most conservators cringe, but he actually heated up the coffin to get him loose from this goop, and even more than that, he ended up cutting the mummy into 3 pieces to get him out of that, so they can examine. Now, back today, we'd never do anything like that. He'd be left in situ, and there would be better techniques that could have got him out of that. But back then, they weren't as concerned about the mummy as they were about all the goods. The mummy was secondary, but so therefore he took a hot knife and cut him out of that. So there's that right there did a lot of just horrible damage to the mummy. But even more than that, it was found that the mummy was already damaged. In fact, the bandages to the mummy, when he touched them, he said they were like ash. They literally looked like they had been burned, and the mummy itself looked like it had been somehow baked, not just preserved but baked. Well, we finally figured out why. They had in those ointments they poured over him had linseed oil, and linseed will react and it will actually self-combust. If you take linseed oil and put it in some rags, throw it down, it will catch fire. Linseed oil can be very dangerous. And what looks like happened is that after they buried him, it had that chemical reaction and it actually caught fire. But because of lack of oxygen inside of all those coffins, it basically just smoldered when it hit up. So basically, which burnt all the most of the bandages, and the mummy was kind of baked, and it wasn't really burnt up. It was just kind of baked. So this poor mummy was kind of glued in his coffin, had been cut out with a hot knife, and had almost self-combusted. So Tutankhamun mummy was in horrible condition. And it was hard to tell anything about him, about what had happened to that mummy. And also, after Howard Carter had finished excavating the tomb, the mummy was actually decided to be left inside of his coffin in his tomb, and that's where he remained. And it was, they did not open it. But after all these speculations as to what happened to Tutankhamun, finally, the technology had reached the point where they could actually bring in a manual X-ray machine, and in 1969, it was allowed for them to take Tutankhamun's head out and do an X-ray on it. Well, looking at that X-ray, the expert at the time said that from the back of the head, and even though he said it is within normal range, it looked like that there was a bone fragment and a blood clot in the back of the skull. So all of a sudden, Tutankhamun had been murdered. And there were books written, Who Murdered Tutankhamun, and the whole plots, and Horemheb got blamed, and I got blamed, and there was entire books and articles and documentaries made for the next 40 years, 45, next 40 years, and then finally, after all these questions, they finally got a CT scanner that could go in there, and they actually took the mummy out the second time he had ever left his tomb since he was placed in there, and they took him out and they did a CT scan in 2010, and now they had the complete body to look at, and they looked at the back of the skull, and it appears that had just appeared to have been a shadow from the original X-ray, maybe where it got moved a little bit, but there was no damage to the back of the skull whatsoever. There was no blow, there was no clot, there was no nothing. So much for the murder. So 40 years worth of speculations just went right out the window. You can still find those books, which are kind of funny to read now. Hey, discoveries, we roll with what we get. So, but then it became exactly what happened. Well, the DNA and the CT scan showed us a lot. One thing it showed us was that Tutankhamun was not a very healthy young man. For one, he had severe scoliosis. In fact, so severe that it's found that the part of the spine of the back of the neck, the bones were so fused, it's likely he couldn't even turn his head, especially as he got up into an older teen. Also, it was found that he had a degenerative bone disorder in his leg. in his left leg. So, and that was actually causing the bone to deteriorate, which answered one question. It was actually found, they found over 200 canes, walking canes, in Tutankhamun's tomb, which was very unusual, So, and when they were inspected, it was found that these were not ornamental. They had been used. There were scuff marks on the bottom. So all of these canes, well, now we know why he used them. He had a bum leg. So he would have had a crooked back. He would have had a lame leg. He would have had to walk with a cane. He wouldn't have ever been able, toward the end, to turn his head. But he also had insult to injury. It was found that he had, at the time of his death, he had the most severe form of malaria that you could get. Now, a lot of young people can survive malaria. However, with his health so compromised, I'm sure that didn't help. It probably just made it worse. And examining it's still a bit of a mystery is exactly what killed Tutankhamun. The one thing that's found from the CT scan, and it's really hard to tell because of so much damage that's been done to this mummy, since death. But one thing that they did think they found was that on the knee of the bad leg, it looks like the kneecap had been knocked off, and there was some signs of the beginnings of healing, which means that this was knocked off during life. And if you got his kneecap knocked off, they had no knowledge of germs, they had no knowledge of antiseptics, so this would have quickly got infected. It would have turned septic, and with him already weakened by malaria, he would have died. But there is, again, I'd said in the Akhenaten video that we run to the romantic a lot of times in history. People's like, oh, well, maybe he fell off of a chariot. He fell off his chariot and broke his knee, and the infection set in, and that's how he died. Well, number one is, like I said in that earlier video, it's very interesting he didn't hurt his hands. No damage to his hands or his arms at all. No broken arms. And that's if you fall off something, that's the first thing you do is throw up your hands. You would have damaged at least some other bone. Doesn't seem to be only his kneecap. That tells me that this is more of an isolated accident. So I think, and once again, it's on the side of his on the side with the bum leg. And actually, you can do some CSI here. Okay, so let's put it together. He has a bum leg. This bad leg that he has to walk with a cane, and he also has malaria, and the kneecap's been knocked off. Most likely scenario from that evidence, he's sick. He's got a high fever. He goes to stand up. He's got this bum leg. In his sickened, weakened condition, he falls. He hits his kneecap, maybe on the side of a step, maybe just on the hard stone floor. It breaks the knee. He can't break himself. He busts his kneecap off. He's already ill. Infection would have set in. His body wouldn't have been prepared to fight this infection. Couldn't have, even in the best conditions, it probably couldn't have fought off the infection, but because he already had malaria, that weakened him even further. It would go septic, and he dies at about the age of 19. And that is the most likely way that Tutankhamun died. Now, there is still a question on this, because they also found there's some speculation that his chest had been damaged and his ribs had been cut away, because the chest seemed to have been filled with all of these wadded linen bandages. And there's speculation he had some sort of chest injury. And of course, they've got romantic on that and said maybe it was from a hippo hunt. A bite from a hippo would definitely do that. Maybe he did fall off a chariot and go under the wheels and it crushed him. However, I'm a little, to me, the verdict is still out on that, because I'm not sure that isn't post damage, post-mortem damage to that mummy. Why? Because we do know that even though Tutankhamun was found intact and his mummy was found intact, that during World War II, the security around the tomb, with Tutankhamun still in there, all of the grave goods except for the golden coffin had been taken out, We do know that the security got slack and robbers did get in there, because Tutankhamun was originally shown to have a beautiful beaded cap on his head. Well, when they opened up in 2010, the cap is gone, and also there was just damage to the chest. So I'm not sure that that damage wasn't done, because all the bones look like they have been snapped. I'm not sure if that damage hadn't been done to the mummy during that robbery, just like the removal of that cap during that time period, or if it had been actually something done in ancient times. Some say yes, some say no. Some say the breaks look like it was fresh when he was alive. Blah blah blah. Now, the stuffing up in the chest, they removed all the organs. It wasn't odd to stuff the body with different types of things. Usually, sometimes with hay, sometimes with leeches, sometimes with bandages. So that's not that odd. And it may have had nothing to do with the damage. It's those cut off ribs. So until I see something else about the that damage being, while he was, at the time of his death, and not post-mortem long after, then I'm still going to go with the known data that he likely fell and broke off his kneecap and died from a septic reaction from the infection. I still think that's the most likely way that he died. But either way, he did die at 19. Well, now that we've established both who his family was, 2, about his reign, and 3, the cause of his death, now let's talk about why his tomb was the only one that had not been robbed in antiquity in the Valley of the Kings. All the other tombs of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs had been robbed in ancient times, oftentimes robbed by the very men that dug the tombs and put it in there. In fact, robbing tombs in the ancient world was almost like a mafia family business, and it was a very intricate network of robbing these tombs. And a lot of people say, that's horrible they robbed those tombs. Hey, if you're living in a hut down beside the river, and right up, and you're living basically on bread, beer, and onions, and in the hill just up the road is a dead man with tons of gold and goods, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I mean, come on. I hate to say it, but I can't really much blame them there. I love history and love the storage of history, but from a living person's point of view, there's a dead man up there with several tons of gold, and I'm living on bread and beer. Get a shovel. Either way, so all the tombs of the other pharaohs had been robbed. Why is it that Tutankhamun's was the only one that was intact? And actually is a perfect storm of circumstances that protected this tomb. First off was the tomb itself. Tutankhamun, as I said earlier, compared to other pharaohs, was buried basically in a hole in the ground. It's a very, very small tomb. Especially for a pharaoh, it's practically nothing. I mean, it's basically just 4 small rooms. Tutankhamun, and it was cram packed. There's a little storage room, a little antechamber of storage room, a main room, and then you have the main burial chamber. And even that, was only a few inches between the walls and the golden mausoleum that was in there. So, this is a very small tomb. And being as he had died young and unexpected, a lot of the funerary goods in there was kind of from the royal surplus. A lot of the beds had the names of Akhenaten or Semenkari, were commonly found in a lot of the tomb goods, or you could see where it had been taken off and Tutankhamun's name had been added. So it's a lot of surplus goods that was put in there that they could scrounge together during the time of Tutankhamun's mummification to get this tomb ready, and so it was it was a very small tomb. Now the reason it was a very small tomb is that after Tutankhamun died, he died without an heir. He and Akhenaten, it does look like, had 2 daughters. or she had miscarried 2 daughters, because in his tomb it was found a box with 2 small coffins inside, and inside those coffins was 2 mummified fetuses, in some in the and both in the 3rd trimester, that have been preserved. DNA has definitely proven that Tutankhamun was their father, and so thus Tutankhamun had died without an heir, and so. Therefore, and in truth, that was one of the real tragedies of Tutankhamen's death, is that he really was the last of the paternal line of pharaohs, going all the way back to Tutmosis I, and the daughter of Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty. Tutankhamun was the last of that bloodline, and with his death. With his death went the line of the 18th dynasty pharaohs. And in fact, who became pharaoh after him? Well, the closest thing they had to the family line, they married in uncle of Akhenaten and father-in-law of Akhenaten and grandfather to Tutankhamen's wife, and who would also be his great uncle. That's the closest they had. So and he also had the power in the cloud. He became, even though he was an old man, he became pharaoh. And you see in his tomb, as the pharaoh always does, one of the rites of the pharaoh is to bury the previous pharaoh in his succession. And we see performing the Sim priest rites of the opening of the mouth during the funeral on the walls of Tutankhamen's tomb, which was very little hieroglyphs or any reliefs on the wall. It was just these 1 or 2 panels. Once again, a small tomb. But once became pharaoh upon Tutankhamen's death, Tutankhamun had been preparing started a very nice tomb further up in the Valley of the Kings. But now that he had died, I decided to take over Tutankhamen's big tomb he was building, and he decided to put him into his tomb that he had prepared. He had been given the right to, as a noble, a great honor, to build a vizier's tomb, smaller tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And he put Tutankhamun in his modest tomb, and he took over the big tomb that Tutankhamun was building. So Tutankhamun was basically buried in a smaller servant's royal noble's tomb. So it was a small tomb. That's one thing that helped save it. And it would have been a quick burial. Number 2, it does look like the tomb had been robbed, or attempted to be robbed. As I said, Howard Carter found a robber's hole that had been filled back in. Well, apparently robbers had gone in there and rummaged things around. In fact, there were still footprints of the robbers that was climbing over things to get things. And in one corner, they'd pulled a bunch of stuff out. But it looks like they got caught by the guard. I think old Horemheb who was still the head of the army. He was a general. Had been, I think he had things under control, and his censure and his guards, they caught them. And one of the signs that they did catch them is when they opened up the tomb door. Laying just on the inside was a small bag with a few rings and a few other things in it, and it was a robber's bag. So apparently they've caught these guys, dragged them out, and rather than go back in the tomb, they just took their little robber bag of things they got and just tossed it back through the hole, and then sealed the hole up. And there it laid for 3,300 years, right where they tossed it back in. So now it's a small tomb, and now people trying to rob it got caught. So to the grave robbing mafia that existed in Egypt, now this tomb, they're onto us on that one. So that tomb became taboo for a while. Forget that one. Let's leave it alone. Let's leave this tomb alone for a while. So that saved it for a while. Now it would have been robbed. They would have gotten in there and robbed it in a few years. However, within 6 months after that, it actually rained in the Valley of the Kings. Now, it rarely rains in the Valley of the Kings, maybe once every 50 to 100 years. And when it does rain in the Valley of the Kings, all of that loose brick dust and all of that limestone dust turns to liquid mud. And there are great of these big gravel liquid mud landslides. This happened, and Tutankhamun's tomb is at the bottom of this valley, and all of this big massive mudslide of all this limestone and dust and water came sliding down and completely obliterated over top of his tomb. And this stuff, when it dries, turns hard as, it's like cement. It turns hard as rock, turns hard as cement. So that wiped out all signs of where the tomb had been. So now the tomb's lost underneath this landslide of concrete and loose limestone. So that wiped it all out. So now it's kind of forgotten where it is, and it's under a layer of hardened, dried limestone mud. Then that pretty much sealed it right there. Then a couple hundred years later, the Pharaoh Ramses VI, they were digging a tomb just above his, and they threw all of the debris from digging that tomb on top of the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. So now it's completely sealed off. So this perfect storm of him being a rather, easily forgotten pharaoh, a boy king that ruled for 10 years, the fact he was buried in a small noble's tomb, that and then this landslide. Well, they tried to rob it and got caught. Which put the robbers off the tomb for a while, and then this massive landslide of gravel and mud that sealed it like in concrete, and then the construction that threw debris over top of it is a perfect storm, and that for the preservation of this tomb. And that is why Tutankhamun's tomb was the only tomb in the Valley of the Kings that was preserved and intact. All the rest being robbed in antiquity. It was basically sealed under a landslide and forgotten. And that's the reason Tutankhamun's tomb is the most famous tomb discovery in the world, and he is the most well-known pharaoh in the world. It's all because of a mudslide and some really good guards. Now, one thing I want to talk about here, as being we're dealing with the burial and the tomb of Tutankhamun, is the famous curse of Tutankhamun's tomb. And let me tell you now, it's bullshit. There is no curse. And I'm going to explain exactly why. This action and how this came about. Now, the rumor came about, or this legend of this curse, because of a newspaper. What had happened was Howard Carter, he was a great archaeologist, Egyptologist, an excavator, but he was not very good, in PR. And one of the things that he did, because he's being aggravated by so much of the press coming at him from all angles, he actually sold the story only to one newspaper. And and he would they were allowed access to anything that was going on. Well, that's ticked off the other newspapers. This was the hottest story going around, and they had now been kicked off of it. So therefore, they come up with things to talk about, and it was actually a newspaper that invented this curse, a curse upon the people that had disturbed the tomb of the pharaoh. And it was claimed that in the tomb there was found a gold tablet that said, basically, may the wings of death smite any who disturb the rest of the pharaoh. Okay, two things about that. Number one, that tomb was meticulously documented and recorded. Everything in it, every the smallest bead that was found on the floor was numbered, registered, and documented. Everything in that tomb had a number and had a documentation to it. And there is no record of this tablet being found. That's number one. Number two, the wording of this so-called curse is pure Hollywood. because it's not Egyptian at all. The Egyptians didn't have an angel of death, with the smite, with the wings of death. So this doesn't even sound anything like an Egyptian. Egyptian. This doesn't sound Egyptian. This doesn't sound like an Egyptian curse. Now, and also, being as we're on that, I would also say that curses were not common in tombs. A tomb was seen by the Egyptians as a mechanism, and this mechanism was made for the pharaoh to get in to move on into the afterlife, and that has been laid out in the Book of the Dead. It was the spells and the rituals and the preparations of the body and the preparation of everything he would need in the afterlife. This was a working mechanism. So, and they didn't really put a curse on that of it, However, but I have seen some curses that had been put in some tombs, but they're nothing like this so-called tablet. And they usually were always put on the doorway, on the inside of the door or on the outside panel. And there's no curse on the outside panel of Tutankhamen's tomb. And these curses don't sound nearly as poetic and sophisticated as may the wings of death smite he who disturbs the pharaoh. No, they're a little more crude and specific. The most common one that you find is may no impure person enter this tomb, and if they do, may they be raped by a donkey, or may their mother be raped by a donkey, or may their daughter be raped by a donkey. Apparently being raped by a donkey was a great humiliation and fear in ancient Egypt for whatever reason, an insult. It was always be raped by a donkey. So, and to my knowledge, when Howard Carter opened that tomb, he wasn't ever raped by a donkey. Now, let me tell you, if he had broke the seal to that tomb and immediately a donkey come charging down the hill and just pow, give it to him right there, I'd believe in curses. but that didn't happen. So thus, there is no curse. Now, this was actually even bolstered even more by the sudden death of Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the expedition and financed the excavation of the tomb. He died rather suddenly while they were clearing the tomb. However, what had happened with this had nothing to do with a curse. What's going to be remembered is that Lord Carnarvon was in Egypt because his doctors had told him to move there because of his health. He was not in good health. In fact, he had weak lungs. He got into a motorcycle accident which had damaged his lungs, and they said that they believed that the dry air of Egypt would actually help extend his life and help his lungs. Well, so he was not a well man in the first place. That's the reason he was there. And what seems to have happened, the story goes, is that he got a mosquito bite, and that he had shaved it, and he cut that bite shaving, and it got infected, and then he developed a high fever, and because he had weakened lungs and he got sick, he had turned to pneumonia. And when man with the weak lungs, the water in his lungs, he finally succumbed to pneumonia and died. And once again, this was a man with a very delicate health in the first place, so it wasn't that big surprise. But boy, that really boosted up the curse of Tutankhamen's tomb. And of course, there's other stories about other people that died associated with the tomb. Well, guess what? People die. There's a lot of people that worked on that tomb. And with any circumstance, any group of people, if you have enough people, give it 10 years, and there's going to be several of them that will die. Some will die in car accidents, some will die in, some will die of disease. That's natural. If I sat and looked at like a place I've worked 10, 15 years ago and look at who has passed away, and it would look like a curse. I worked at one place back 20 years ago, and several people I know that worked there had heart attacks and died. One person was killed in a car accident. One actually was murdered. Was there a curse in the place I worked? No, that's just life. If you have a group of people, over time, everybody dies and accidents happen. That's just statistics. So there is no curse, and the type of curse that they would have had for ancient Egypt, it doesn't fit with this made up curse from the newspapers. And also, even though Lord Carnarvon died, let's not forget that Howard Carter, the man who actually opened the tomb, who actually cut the pharaoh out of his coffin, he lived well up into his 60s, and and he enjoyed a fairly, for that time, a fairly good life. So much for the curse. Now, after Tutankhamun died and his mummy and his tomb had been sealed under this wet mudslide and lost forever, eventually Ai, who had succeeded him, he died after a 4-year reign, and Horemheb, his general, became pharaoh. And he was very much a militant man, and he really kind of straightened up Egypt. And Egypt had still been a mess after the Amarna period and the disastrous Otanism of Akhenaten. There had been a lot of corruption. There had been a lot of a lot of their enemies had been encroaching on their territory. They were losing a lot of tribute for their empire. So Horemheb shored that up. He didn't get the lands back of the places that they conquered, but he did stop the corruption in ancient Egypt, and he started to eradicate that the Amarna period had ever taken place. And one of the ways that he did that was he started taking over any monument that Tutankhamun or Akhenaten or Ai had put up, and he took their names off and he put his names on their monuments and on their statues. So, and also, this was carried on by the Ramesside dynasty, whom Horemheb had put on the throne. He had died without an heir. He'd made a general friend of his, Ramses I, to be his heir, who became pharaoh. And the Ramesside dynasties followed in his practice of eradicating the Amarna period. So, like in City the First list of the kings, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, Akhenaten, Semenkhkare, Ai, and Tutankhamun are not on that list. It jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. In fact, Horemheb claimed his reign from the end of Amenhotep III's reign. So he cut out this, over 30-year period is just eradicated, disappeared. And along with that, in ancient Egypt, Tutankhamun had disappeared, and was basically a forgotten pharaoh, which makes it so ironic that he was that he now is the most known pharaoh in the world. I think that's a great revenge, because according to the way the Egyptians believed, once your name was no longer spoken, you ceased to kind of exist. People had to speak your name. People had to make offerings to you to keep you up, especially for a pharaoh, who had mortuary temples, so they kept making offerings for the pharaoh in the afterlife. All these pharaohs in Tutankhamun were now denied that. And so, and they believe once your name was no longer spoken, no longer remembered, you cease to exist in the afterworld. Well, most people don't know the names of Horemheb and a lot of the other pharaohs. Like, how many people have heard of the pharaoh's name Intef or Montuhotep, or Amenemhet or Senwosret? Only some historians and Egyptologists know these names. But Tutankhamun, his name is known worldwide. If you say name a pharaoh, almost everybody's going to say King Tut. So from that standard of the Egyptians, Tutankhamun is kind of had his revenge. He is, if his name to be spoken keeps him alive, then he is now eternal. And I love that. Well, folks, that's all I've got about Tutankhamun, the boy king, the pharaoh that was forgotten in ancient Egypt, his name no longer spoken, and now he is the most famous and well-known pharaoh in the modern world. Everybody knows the name of King Tut, and his name will be spoken forever. And by Egyptian standards, that makes him eternal. So listen, if you're enjoying my videos, then please subscribe. Go down to this little purple chair, hit it, give me a subscribe, also give me a like. And if you have any questions or any comments about Tutankhamun or anything else that I'm talking about, I'd love to hear it. So you know what, until I see you next time, find yourself a cozy chair, get yourself a good book, and find your passion. Later.